Final Fantasy VII's 25th anniversary back in 2022 was met with the degree of ceremony you might expect of a medieval monarch, with Yoshinori Kitase and co. rolling out the red carpet to host a series of events and compilation releases and Buster Sword alarm clocks to commemorate the momentous quarter century since the game was first published. So one may be forgiven for expecting at least perhaps a mention upon Final Fantasy VIII's 25th anniversary, or at least something beyond the solitary tweet on their social media account. So something of an interesting snub for one of Square's top 5 best-selling video games of all time, and it's interesting to consider here the purgatorial fate that has befallen Final Fantasy VIII that I think has occurred for a number of reasons, starting way back when the game was first released, and what this means for the potential of a remake that increasing numbers of fans are clamouring for. Now, at the time of its release, back in 1999, the reaction to Final Fantasy VIII was pretty divisive, and as I've noted before, it's interesting and heartening to see that history has actually become quite kind to FF8, and retrospectively, it is considered increasingly as one of the most unique and narratively ambitious Final Fantasy games, and this goes for both legacy players and a surprising number of newer players who have worked their way through the back catalogue of the anthology, remarking on how much they now enjoy Final Fantasy VIII. And this is in stark contrast to the first decade of the 2000s, which saw a lot of shade being thrown at the game for, among other things, being comprised of a supposedly quite homogenous party that weren't that interesting, a supposedly unlikable emo protagonist, the Junction system, of course, the ease of completion, and so on. And those that dislike the game can just about bring themselves to admit that they enjoy the soundtrack, the opening FMV, but they tend to denounce it on basically every other front. So why does this matter? Well, the production team at Square, unlike many development studios, have always been quite sensitive and attentive to feedback from fans, even in the pre-social media days, and I think this bodes both good and ill that they react to our reactions, with Yoshinori Kitase mentioning some time ago that even back when they used to receive letters and fan mail by post, they would take into account the feedback they were getting and help it shape their opinions and their approaches. And this may seem like a good thing until we acknowledge the fact that actually quite often the loudest voices, and those that are incensed enough to write a letter, are often in the extremes of opinion in both directions. And what this means coming to today for Final Fantasy VIII is that while it was arguably the first truly Nougat game, back then at least, because it was the product of Yoshinori Kitase's creative control, while series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi was off making The Spirits Within. So in principle, Final Fantasy VIII was probably the biggest emotional investment for Kitase and his team at the time, and yet all of this backlash about junction systems and moody protagonists that persisted for over a decade following the release of that game, it has, it seems, led the company and Kitase to distance themselves from the project entirely, with Kitase noting even recently that he would have no input and no personal involvement if any Final Fantasy VIII Remake were to take place in future. Beyond this, the thematic and narrative backbone that served to distinguish Final Fantasy VIII so much, which was this relationship between past and present, the plight of our hero Squall and his forebear Laguna, this Venn diagram of overlapping arcs and relationships, and the conflation of space-time to create this causal loop for our central story. Well, a lot of these elements, or types of elements, involving past and present and the conflation of time, seem to have been lifted and shifted over to the Final Fantasy VII universe, with the remake saga, with this currently muddling scenario of Zack's survival running in tandem, apparently, with Cloud's adapted legacy story. So while this story isn't exactly a carbon copy of how Final Fantasy VIII played out and delivered on these themes, it's still very much in the same arena, and I would be amazed if the company would go for a Final Fantasy VIII remake anywhere near the proximity of Final Fantasy VII Remake, when they are both exploring these comparable plot devices and themes of time. Next, we have the battle and levelling gameplay systems, and what we've seen with Final Fantasy VII is, I think, a fantastic adaptation of that particular multi-party materia-based battle system. And I can't stress enough how much I really enjoyed the adaptation that we've seen of that in the remake games. But again, relating back to these criticisms of the Junction system, Yoshinori Kitase has also stated that any hypothetical Final Fantasy VIII remake would need to radically rework junctioning. And actually, I've dedicated an entire episode to discussing the Junction system and theoretically tweaking it and reworking it, and I'll link to that here. But the main problem here, if we assume that the Junction system is flawed, which consensus tells us that it is that as much, if not more so, than any other Final Fantasy game, Final Fantasy VIII's lore, setting and story is deeply integrated with its mechanics and systems, and junctioning in particular is basically the backbone of the entire story, the entire adventure that we experience. Ultimecia, the antagonist, travels back through time using the junction machine alone to look for the character alone who can junction people to past memories. And then of course we have the Guardian forces who are junctioned and cause this much hypothesized amnesia in the game, which makes our party forget their childhood. So junctioning is integral to Final Fantasy VIII. It's completely baked into the essence of how we play and understand the world that we inhabit there. So while there are variables with how the mechanic might be used in gameplay, it can't be discounted entirely because it is at the heart of what makes Final Fantasy VIII take place. Now, honestly speaking, although I quite enjoyed the novelty of the Junction system, I really enjoyed how it worked story-wise, we can't blame fans who disliked it, and subsequently Square for distancing themselves from it, because that consensus obviously comes from a valid failure of communication or user experience or whatever. And personally, I feel certain things beyond the mechanic itself could have eased the experience of it. I've remarked before on Quistis and the huge swaths of onboarding dialogue that she uses to educate the player in junctioning, which frankly is pretty mundane to endure and read through in the first 15-20 minutes of the game. Yet that could be solved in a modern game where you have these diegetic in-world onboarding moments. You can space it out, you can explore the world map and have this conversation taking place or build up to it. And a common trope for many games is having initial battle encounters being quite simple to sort of onboard you, learning by doing with the certain mechanics and systems that a game has. We saw this in Final Fantasy XV done very well. We saw it in Final Fantasy VII Remake done very well. And indeed, Final Fantasy VIII even lends itself a little bit to it in the original game, because on our first encounter, Quistis teaches us how to use the trigger for the gunblade. So this could easily be modernised and spaced out, and the junction system could be communicated and streamlined to a player a little bit more. But hypotheticals aside, the fact remains that many, including it seems the team that worked on Final Fantasy VIII, have come to view the junction system as a colossal obstacle to the game being remade, which bodes ill for anything coming down the line anytime soon. And realistically, if we look at Square's caution with regards to remakes, if we look at the time and effort it took to get Final Fantasy VII off the ground, which was the flagship title of the series, and anyone would consider that a sure bet in terms of success and financial return, it doesn't bode well for a title that, although best-selling on paper, and although better regarded in hindsight, doesn't have the same promise or reputation of a Final Fantasy VII in terms of risk and reward, cost-benefit, time investment, and so on. And aside from the overlapping plot devices between Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy VII now, I think this is another reason why we might see a Final Fantasy IX remake published first, because Square hedging their bets with what we could consider a middle way between Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, a game that is like these two games from the Golden Era and quite well regarded. This could be the way to go from their mindset, and it is thematically and aesthetically completely different from both Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy VII as well. So a bit of breathing room there. And really, it could be that Final Fantasy VIII's fortunes do reside on the success of a potential Final Fantasy IX remake, because the success of this theorised and rumoured remake may actually pave the way for a myriad of remake projects down the line. But in all, as a long-time Final Fantasy VIII fan, a Final Fantasy VIII fanboy, if you will, The more I look at it, the more I think about it, the more bleak the fortunes seem for a Final Fantasy VIII Remake anytime soon.